Hello, everyone. My name is Linda. I had never imagined, in my wildest dreams, that I'd be reunited with my father, let alone discover he'd left me $50 million. Growing up, my father had always been a mystery, disappearing from my life when I was young. He rarely reached out, and by the time I was old enough to ask questions, he was just a faint memory. But then, out of the blue, I received a letter from his lawyer saying he had passed away and left everything to me. The inheritance was overwhelming. I could barely process the news. $50 million. It felt surreal, as if I were living someone else's life. My husband, Daniel, was equally stunned. At first, he seemed supportive, but over time, his excitement turned into something darker. "Think of all the things we can do with this money," he'd say, his eyes almost glinting with greed. I wanted to use the inheritance wisely, invest it in our future, but Daniel's tone made me uneasy. His excitement didn't feel like ours, it felt like his. As the days went by, Daniel's obsession with the inheritance only grew. He'd bring up plans he'd never mentioned before, buying a mansion, luxury cars, and even talking about investing in risky business ventures he had no experience in. I reminded him gently that we needed to be cautious. "This money could be our security for the rest of our lives," I told him. But he brushed me off, as if my concerns didn't matter. One evening, I came home from running errands and found Daniel pacing around the house, his expression tense. "I've been thinking," he said, "we need to act fast with this money before anyone else tries to come for it. You never know with family lawyers and those so-called relatives." His words chilled me. Why would anyone come for what was legally mine? Daniel's paranoia was starting to scare me, but I tried to keep my cool. A few days later, I realized the bank account where the inheritance was deposited was completely empty. Panic surged through me, and I confronted Daniel. He didn't even try to deny it. He looked at me calmly and said, "I moved the money. You don't need to worry about it." The betrayal hit me like a ton of bricks. My own husband had taken my inheritance without even asking. Anger flared up, but I felt trapped. This was the man I trusted, yet he'd taken everything from me in one selfish move. I felt a storm of emotions brewing inside me: betrayal, anger, disbelief. But I had to think clearly. Confronting Daniel directly about the money would likely push him further, maybe even make him reckless. He was still my husband, but he was a different person now, a man blinded by greed. So, I played along. I acted as if I accepted his decision, pretending to believe he'd moved the money for our own safety. I feigned understanding, telling him I trusted his judgment. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, swallowing my pride and hiding my anger. But deep down, I was plotting my own way to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The first step was to gather evidence. Late at night, while he was asleep, I began digging through his files, checking his emails, and tracing his bank transactions. It was terrifying, knowing that if he caught me, I'd have to explain myself. But I had to take that risk. What I found was worse than I'd expected. Not only had he transferred the money to his own private account, but he'd also started using it to gamble and invest in questionable ventures. I realized then that this wasn't just about greed. He was reckless, willing to throw away my father's legacy for his own gain. Each discovery was like a stab to my heart. The man I once loved and trusted was tearing apart everything I had left of my father. But I knew I had to stay calm. If I confronted him too soon, he could hide the money somewhere I couldn't reach, or worse, spend it all before I could even get to it. I had to be patient, careful. Over the next few weeks, I gathered more evidence, documenting every transfer, every shady deal, every reckless purchase he made. During the day, I kept up my act, playing the part of the supportive wife, watching as he talked about all the grand plans he had for our future. I nodded and smiled, all while feeling the fury bubbling beneath the surface. Then, just when I thought I had enough proof, I noticed something strange. Daniel had started acting paranoid. He'd changed the passwords on his devices frequently, and he seemed jumpy whenever he saw me around his computer or phone. It became clear to me that he was suspecting something. It was time to make my move. I hired a lawyer in secret, someone who specialized in financial disputes and asset recovery. Together, we devised a plan to secure the money and bring Daniel's actions to light. My lawyer assured me that with the evidence I'd collected, I had a strong case. I felt a glimmer of hope, but I knew this was just the beginning. The day finally came for me to put my plan into action. My lawyer and I had arranged a meeting with a forensic accountant to track down every cent Daniel had moved. The goal was simple: to freeze his accounts and prevent him from spending anything further. I also filed a formal complaint, detailing how Daniel had taken the money without my consent. The process was grueling, and I knew it wouldn't be easy to keep all of this a secret from him for long. Just as I anticipated, Daniel started noticing changes. He'd call his bank only to be told that certain funds were on hold. He'd try to make purchases, only to have his transactions declined. His confusion quickly turned into anger. One evening, he confronted me, his face twisted in fury. "What have you done?" he spat, his eyes wild. "Why are the accounts frozen?" I looked him in the eye and calmly said, "I did what I had to do. You took my father's inheritance without asking me, Daniel. You crossed a line." He was speechless for a moment, but then he laughed, a cold, bitter laugh. "You think you can win this? You're nothing without me." His words stung, but I stood my ground. "Maybe that's what you think, but I'm stronger than you know. You've taken enough from me. Now it's my turn." In that moment, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He realized that I wasn't the woman he could manipulate so easily anymore. I'd changed, and he knew it. Daniel's arrogance faded, replaced by desperation. Over the next few days, he tried to intimidate me, threatening to ruin my reputation and even making claims that I'd be nothing without him. But his words no longer held power over me. I'd already decided I wasn't backing down. My lawyer moved quickly, securing court orders that would protect my assets. Every attempt Daniel made to regain control was met with legal resistance, blocking him at every turn. I could see the frustration mounting, and he became erratic, lashing out at anyone who tried to talk to him. He was spiraling, and I knew I had him where I wanted. Then, I initiated the next phase of my plan. Using the evidence of his reckless gambling and fraudulent investments, I filed for divorce, citing financial abuse and betrayal. This wasn't just about getting the money back, it was about exposing him for who he truly was. The court case would be public, and all his dirty dealings would come to light. The night before our first court hearing, Daniel showed up at my door, looking disheveled and defeated. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's talk. We don't have to go through this." But I was done with his lies and manipulation. "We're beyond that, Daniel," I replied coldly. "You made your choice when you took what wasn't yours. Now, you'll face the consequences." The courtroom was tense as our case began. I felt a mix of nerves and resolve as I sat across from Daniel, watching his confidence crumble. My lawyer laid out every piece of evidence we'd collected: the unauthorized transfers, the gambling records, the shady investments. As each detail was revealed, I could see Daniel shrinking in his seat, his face pale. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he tried to paint me as a paranoid wife who'd overreacted. But the evidence was too strong. His web of deceit was unraveling, and the judge saw right through his excuses. I felt a sense of justice finally within reach. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. My lawyer asked the court to award me full control of the inheritance, citing Daniel's financial misconduct and betrayal. The judge agreed, freezing his remaining assets and granting me every last penny he had taken. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't just about the money, it was about reclaiming my life and my dignity. Daniel had taken so much from me, but I had fought back and won. However, I wasn't done. I wanted to make sure he understood the depth of his betrayal. I wanted him to feel the consequences of his actions long after the money was returned. Once the court proceedings ended, Daniel was left with almost nothing. His accounts were frozen, his reputation ruined, and any allies he'd once had abandoned him. But for me, this wasn't just about watching him fall. I wanted to rise above and prove to myself that I could rebuild stronger than ever. With the inheritance back in my control, I made some wise investments. I worked with financial advisors, carefully choosing projects that would not only grow my wealth but also secure a stable future. For the first time, I felt empowered, not because of the money itself, but because I'd taken charge of my own life. Meanwhile, Daniel's life continued to spiral downward. He couldn't hold down a job, and word of his courtroom scandal spread fast. He became a ghost of the man he once was, stumbling through life without the wealth and reputation he had once held over me. People who had once flocked to him for his apparent success now avoided him, seeing him for what he truly was. And as my wealth grew, I started using some of it to help others. I set up a foundation in my father's name, offering scholarships and aid to those in need. It felt like a way to honor his legacy and give back, using the inheritance to bring light into the world rather than feeding greed and selfishness. Each day, I grew stronger, and Daniel's influence faded further from my life. I was no longer defined by his betrayal. Instead, I was building a life I could be proud of, a life he could never take away from me again. Months passed, and my life blossomed in ways I hadn't thought possible. The foundation was thriving, my investments were yielding returns, and I had finally found peace. I was living a life filled with purpose, one where I was in full control of my destiny. Then, one day, I received news that Daniel had tried to contact my lawyer, pleading for a settlement or, at the very least, a portion of the inheritance. He was desperate, drowning in debts from his gambling, and with no one left to turn to. My lawyer advised me that I could ignore him entirely or use this moment to finally close that chapter of my life. I decided to meet him one last time. We met in a small conference room at my lawyer's office. Daniel looked nothing like the man I once knew. He was haggard, his suit wrinkled, and his eyes hollow. He barely looked at me, his once arrogant demeanor replaced with a broken shell of a person. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, almost inaudibly. "I was wrong. I don't have anyone left. I thought I could handle it, but..." I felt a pang of sadness, but not for him, for the memories of the life I thought we would have together. But I knew better than to let sentiment sway me. "Daniel," I said firmly, "you had everything, and you chose greed over love. I gave you chances to do the right thing, but you only cared about yourself." He looked up, and for a moment, I saw a glimmer of the man he used to be, but I knew that image was long gone. "Please, just a small portion," he begged. But I'd already made up my mind. "Goodbye, Daniel," I said, standing up. "This is the last time we'll see each other. I've moved on, and it's time for you to do the same." As I walked out of that room, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. I was done with him, done with the pain he'd caused, and ready to live a life where I was truly free. From that day forward, I thrived, my wealth multiplying, my foundation growing, and my heart finally at peace. I had become much richer, not just in wealth, but in spirit, resilience, and self-worth, far more than I could have ever imagined.